Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee. We are recording today without my usual co-host, Sebastian, who is taking some time away for a new baby. Congratulations, Sebastian. Hope you and family are doing well. Today is January, I think this is the 3rd?
3rd, yeah.
Yeah, January 3rd, 2026. Happy New Year, everyone. And we are recording a special episode from Jerusalem, actually, standing on the roof of the Austrian Hospice with a beautiful view of the old city of Jerusalem, here with my colleague, Olivia Layne, who is filling in for Sebastian and helping us out with a couple episodes. And this is, I think, a really special conversation for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is episode number 40, which for us feels like a big deal. Not sure if it actually is, but, we're new to this podcasting thing, and we're really grateful for all of you who have stuck around to make it through 40 episodes. It's also the first of a two-part conversation we're having here in Israel. And it's just, I think, very special that we get to actually have a conversation in Israel about Israel. So very grateful to be here. The theme of this episode was actually Olivia's idea. So I'm going to pass the mic to her, let her sort of explain what we're going to be doing over the next, this will be a two-part conversation. So next 2 episodes.
So thanks for being here, Josiah, and thanks for having me. I'm super excited to do this for so many reasons. One being, if none of you have met Josiah, he's basically a walking encyclopedia. And I'm constantly pestering him with questions that I have about Israel and about the Middle East. And so I thought it would be a great idea to essentially play a game of hot seat and have him answer some of the most maybe controversial or hot button questions that are really trending in maybe your dining room table and also on social media, pretty much everywhere right now. So that's going to be the theme of what we're going to be talking about today. So jumping right into it, Josiah, my first question for you is, was Israel created because of the Holocaust?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question and a good one. I think it comes up a lot because we've been in places like Yad Vashem here in Israel, which is the memorial museum for the Holocaust here in Jerusalem. And it can, I think, prompt some questions like, is the Holocaust the reason why Israel was founded? People will ask that question, I think, for a couple of different reasons. But for some people, it's a sincere question and they mean it well. For some people, not so much. It's actually meant as a criticism of Israel or its right to exist, basically arguing that Israel doesn't have any natural right to exist. It's just something that was done to pacify the Jews at the expense of someone who wasn't necessarily responsible, in this case, the local Arab population. And I think it's important for us to clarify for both, regardless of what the motivation is, and in both cases, it's important to clarify that the Holocaust is not actually the reason why Israel was created. If you trace some of the history, and if you go back to the early origins of political Zionism, it's actually going to begin developing in the 1800s. Theodor Herzl was doing his work in the late 1800s. Even before the Holocaust, you have him writing about his ideas and people already beginning movements of Aliyah or moving back to Israel, Jewish people moving back well before the Holocaust, actually decades before. So it would not make any sense then to argue that the Holocaust is the only reason why Israel was created. I do think it's important to note for some nuance, of course, that Theodor Herzl was concerned about the problem of anti-Semitism, but he viewed Zionism not just as a solution for the anti-Semitism that the Jews faced and their need to be able to protect themselves. He also viewed it as something that was natural, that was right. It implied a return to their heritage, essentially, more or less. So I think it's important just to clarify that the Holocaust really is not the reason why Israel was created. It was a process that began long before and has just as much to do with the Jewish connection to the land as it does the persecution that they were facing.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you for such a thorough answer. The next question, which I think people often ask in the same breath as they're asking that question, is, did Europeans gift this land to the Jews?
Yeah, another great question. We get this all the time. And again, I don't want to be too long-winded, but a little history lesson probably doesn't hurt here and helps explain sort of why the answer is no, that the Europeans did not gift the land to the Jewish people. I think there are a couple of reasons why I would argue that's not the case. Number one, it denies, or at the very least implies, that there is no Jewish connection to the land. To gift something implies that the Jews did not previously have any claim to or stake in the land of Israel. And that's really not true. If you, again, are familiar with sort of the origin of political Zionism, or even before that, even before it took on a political form, the culture surrounding this idea of return to Zion has been a part of Jewish culture and practice and community for many, many centuries. They were kicked out, of course, by the Romans, but ever since then, there's been a small, continuous presence of Jews in the land. And even those Jews who were not in the land have continued to practice their Judaism or find part of their Jewish identity in the idea that it is their home, even if they were not able to live in that home. So again, I think the first thing to clarify is just that it's not a gift to them because they already had some sort of stake or claim to it prior to the movement back to the land of Israel. As far as the history and the role that the Europeans played, I think there's a couple of things that I think are just worth understanding as far as context. Number one, again, political Zionism really began before there was any active European involvement. You do have events like the Balfour Declaration in the early 1900s. And this is where a lot of people are going to make the arguments that Europeans are the ones who basically created the possibility of a Jewish state. They gave it to the Jewish people when they didn't have a right to, and that sort of thing. But you have to understand, political Zionism had already begun developing in the late 1800s. Movement back to Israel or Aliyah had already begun in the decades prior, when the Ottomans actually controlled the territory and were allowing these movements of immigration to happen. So it's not actually the Europeans that lay the groundwork or the foundation for this process to happen. If you know a bit of your history, detailed history of Zionism, the Europeans are actually pushing against it originally. They were coming up with these crazy ideas that, of course, we need to find some way to solve our Jewish problem, so to speak. But they didn't have the idea to send them back to their homeland. They were trying to come up with other places where you could send the Jewish people, like Uganda. They arbitrarily came up with this idea that let's just send the Jews to Africa. They can create a state there. We don't have to give them anything of any real value, and we can get them off our hands. That's of course not what the Jewish people wanted, because it's not their homeland, and that would have been actual colonialism and just been so inappropriate in many ways. But that's the role the Europeans were trying to play. They weren't really trying to help the Jews create a Jewish state in their homeland originally. Even after the British kind of committed to this idea, they were playing a role which entailed almost as much acting as an obstacle as it did actually moving things forward. During the interwar period, during World War II, there was sort of this on-again, off-again relationship with Zionism where they would sometimes encourage it, sometimes discourage it. And it really became a pretty testy relationship between the Jews and the British Empire. When it comes time then to, get to 1947, and then there's this rendition plan because the British are tired of trying to, fight this fight and continue to manage the situation themselves. It's important to note who actually is voting for this partition plan, because the majority of the countries who voted for it are actually not European countries, who actually have countries from other parts of the world, like Latin America, Asia, Africa. These are places that are actually or more likely at the time to be in support of the idea of this partition plan and the idea of creating a Jewish state and an Arab state. So when you know all the history, I think it falls apart fairly quickly, the idea that the Europeans came up with this idea by themselves and forced it through, when in reality, that's just not the case.
Okay, my next question stems from something that I've been seeing trending really frequently online. It's like one of the most, if you get to any anti-Semitic video on the internet, it's going to be usually one of the top comments, which is, are Israelis, and therefore by extension Jews, all white and European?
Well, yeah, before I answer that, where do you think that question is coming from?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons. One is just a lack of having ever been to Israel, which is why I think the work that we do at Passages is so incredibly important, because you land in Israel and 5 seconds into your trip, you realize how incredibly false that narrative is. But I also think part of it just stems from a lot of young Americans tend to look at the world through a very American lens. And by extension of that, they tend to view everything, including conflicts around the world, through the history of America. So for the example of the United States, young Americans think of ourselves as a, colonial entity. We're occupiers, we're oppressors. And so therefore, when they think about a place like the Middle East, having no other perspective than the one that they were raised in, they often tend to think of what's happening here through that same lens. So if I had to take a guess as to why I think so many young people are thinking that way, that would probably be what I would say about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. But and that's why I think it's important to understand a bit more the details of who the Jewish people are, what Jewish identity actually is. I think one of the things that stood out to me as well, in addition to the reasons you gave for why people often think that way, I think honestly, to your point, most people who haven't been to Israel have not come into close encounter with many Middle Eastern Jews. And if you think about it, most of the Jewish people, the stories about the Jewish people that are taught to many Christians today are of two types. It's either the biblical stories, the very old stories, or it's the Holocaust, which was not exclusively a European Jewish experience, but it was, I think it's fair to say, the majority of the victims were European Jews. And so it's often taught as a European event, and it does kind of distort our perception of who the Jewish people are when those are really your two sort of entry points to the story of the Jewish people. But the Jewish people obviously are more diverse than that. The Israelis that we come into contact with every day working here are also much more diverse than that. And the reasons why, I think, is the gap in what's taught many Christians is diaspora history. What happened when the Romans scattered the Jewish people and forced them to leave their homeland, or a majority of them to leave their homeland? Well, they then left and started to settle in other parts of the world. Sure, some of them wound up in Europe, but others settled in other parts of the world in which they very quickly settled there and made long-term homes, long-term enough that they were able to, over time, actually take on some of the identifying characteristics or key traits of the people around them. So the Jews that we're most familiar with, again, European Jews, are Ashkenazis, but that's not the entirety of the Jewish people. You also have Sephardic Jews who are from places like the Iberian Peninsula, for example, Spain, Portugal. You also have Mizrahi Jews who are from the Middle East and North Africa. You really, I think, need to understand that in order to understand who the Jewish people actually are, that continue to be ever more a group of people whose DNA is Semitic in nature, of the Middle East. The majority of people who live in Israel actually are Mizrahi or Sephardic. They're not European Jews. They're people who are very hard actually to distinguish from Arabs. So, sometimes it's actually very difficult to tell if someone is a Jewish Israeli or an Arab Israeli because they're both from the Middle East. And that, I think, helps answer the question. But also, if I could add one more little tidbit, gives you a little bit of insight into Israeli culture and politics as well. Because when you're here, it's not a predominantly European culture. It's actually a place with a lot of Middle Eastern culture. It's a Western-style democracy in terms of its governments, but ironically, it is a Western-style democracy for Middle Eastern people, more or less, which is why you see some of the headlines you do about some of the political debates that they're having, especially between some of the more secular progressive or more traditional conservative religious Jews who happen to be, again, primarily from the Middle East, actually. It's a really, really fascinating sort of mix of people who live here, make up the Jewish people, make up Israel. But the important thing, to wrap it all up, is that no, we're not all white or European.
So my next question, this is like an interesting one because I think there's a lot of confusion, and I'll be honest, even myself, I think there's confusion as well. And I think that's just because of whenever you come to Israel, you always see how much more there is to learn about the history of the land. So with that in mind, when we're talking Palestinians, are Palestinians a race? Are they an identity? Are they a religion? Are they an ethnicity? Can you elaborate and explain a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, well, I think the reason why people tend to ask this question is because there's this debate over whether the Palestinians are an authentic collective group or a made-up identity. Really, I mean, unfortunately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in many ways a conflict of identity politics. And so it's part of why there's so many debates over things like, are the Jews all European? Are the Palestinians real? Is it made up or fake? That sort of thing. And so that's a bit of context as far as why this question comes up as often as it does. It's both sides of the conflict questioning the legitimacy of the other, the honesty of the other as well. Palestinians, I think, I don't want to get too into the weeds on this because we actually did a whole video on this subject as part of our Israel Explained series on YouTube. So I would encourage any of our listeners to go check that out. We'll try to put a link in the show notes. But just a couple of high-level observations that I do think might be a useful starting point for more conversations about that. One, I think it's a mistake, in my opinion, assume that there is no collective identity for Palestinians and it's entirely made up. That's really not the case. Like, there is such a thing as an authentic Palestinian identity. It's not really an ethnicity per se. So why do I say that? For example, many Palestinians are Arab, but not all Palestinians necessarily identify as Arab. There can be a bit of complexity there, actually, a little bit of nuance. And it's true, again, that they do share other traits and characteristics. Many of those, for quite a long time, were primarily cultural, linguistic, or based on their connection to the land. So there is something similar to the Jewish connections to the land. There are many non-Jewish inhabitants of the land who have a shared connection to it that expresses itself in the form of Palestinian identity. It didn't necessarily begin to express itself politically until very close to or even after the time period when the Jews started to organize themselves in the form of political Zionism in order to express their connection to the land. So you had sort of these parallel tracks where the two groups were kind of starting the same process around the same time, actually. But it is important to know those basics. It's hard to explain what exactly it is, however, because there's still an ongoing debate within Palestinian society. So, for example, it's not necessarily an ethnicity. Are the primary unifying characteristics religious or not? That's part of why there's such a stark conflict right now between groups like Hamas, which is an Islamist organization, and Fatah, which is actually a secular political party. Palestinian leadership argues that Palestinian society should not be defined necessarily on strict ideological or religious terms. Because those debates are still ongoing, and because frankly, I don't think those questions are necessarily settled yet or have answers. It is a little bit hard to explain with precision what is a Palestinian, but hopefully that gives you, a few things to think about.
That's some great background, and I highly recommend the YouTube video that Passages has made about this on our Israel Explains series. It's very, very helpful because the situation is obviously incredibly nuanced, and there's a lot of historical context that's needed in order to understand these things. And that can be super overwhelming. So if you're looking for a good resource and a place to start, the Israel Explained series is super helpful in sort of unpacking some of those hot topic issues that also sometimes are like difficult to ask questions about. And it can be intimidating to ask those kinds of questions. My next question, and this one's obviously a very heated one and also a very common one.
It is a hot seat exercise.
It is hot seat. So it's appropriate. Is Israel an apartheid state? I have my own thoughts, but I'm going to let you go first.
Do you mind if I pass it back?
No, yeah, you can. Yeah, I think being here right now, exactly where we're standing, is a perfect example of why Israel is not an apartheid state. We are standing in the Muslim quarter in what's called the Austrian Hospice, is the roof of the building that we're on, which is a Christian organization. And the soldiers that are guarding this building are Israelis in the IDF. And it's so interesting because I think there's no place that sort of get a feel for the culture here and the diversity here better than the old city and walking around, because there are so many people here who are visibly religious. And so you can get a better depiction of the diversity in this land and how often it is that people are living side by side with conflicting religious views about maybe who this lands belong to and still choosing to live side by side. I think it's such an interesting place to be. And I'm really glad that we picked this location for this topic specifically. That's my view on it. So I would love to hear more of it.
Yeah, well, first I'll just make an interesting note, add an observation to your own about where we are and who is sort of surrounding us. The police, the individuals guarding the street that we're on. If you noticed earlier this morning when we walked by them, there's a very interesting collection of people. You had one Ethiopian Israeli, who's obviously Black. You had one who looked to be a Middle Eastern Jew, I'm guessing from Yemen. You had one guy who seemed like he was Druze, which is a whole other story. And none of these individuals were white. Really, really interesting, I think, the kind of contrast between what you hear online and the reality that you encounter or experience when you're walking around here, especially in the old city of Jerusalem. That everything's so dense and so many different kinds of people living together every day. I think that the question is an interesting one, and typically it comes up in part because there have been concerted efforts to promote this narrative in an organized fashion with an agenda. It really is sort of born out of efforts to co-opt the narrative about what happened in South Africa, which was a true apartheid,
Right.
really horrific, and then sort of superimpose that on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a way of framing it so people could understand it differently. And the agenda then was to really push this idea that critics of Israel should boycott Israel. It was really, I think, no, I don't want to say that they came up with the idea, but really the group that popularized the idea was the BDS movement, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction. And their goal essentially is to delegitimize Israel and its right to exist by labeling it as an apartheid state and then saying, if you were good enough, moral enough to boycott South Africa, then you should be on the right side of history, do the same thing to Israel. It's in my opinion, pretty dangerous, both because it's misleading in terms of the claims that it makes about Israel, but also because it doesn't do much to actually advance peace or help Palestinians. In many cases, it actually works against Palestinians and has some pretty severe economic impacts on them. And it further entrenches the conflict. It really doesn't do anything to promote dialogues of coexistence or peace between Israelis and Palestinians. The fact that it's misleading is, I think, primarily based on just the basics that you shared, and we've already observed the fact that if you're actually here in Israel, and apartheid is a state in which the government has two sets of rules for its citizens, typically based on racial lines or things of that nature, and it means that they formally deny one group basic rights that are afforded to another, and that they engage in a formal legalized practice of discrimination. And that's just not the case here. And you can make an argument, of course, that minorities, by virtue of being minorities and having less representation in a democratic system, have access to fewer resources. Of course, those are problems that democracies are always going to have, and I don't want to pretend like there are no problems in Israel. That's not true, but it's also not true that there is an organized, intentional campaign to discriminate against or deny basic rights to citizens of one color that are given to another.
I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, I see an example of, young Americans who are very quick to throw out the label against Israel. It often comes from the perspective of, well, America had Jim Crow laws and segregation, and so they automatically assume that Israel, who they obviously view as an extension or an arm of the United States and the West and all of these things, they automatically superimpose that onto the land here and assume that that must be true about Israel when it's not. So that's just another thing that I noticed as well, especially when talking to people who hold that viewpoint. My other question for you is, and I think this is spoken a lot by people who their parties are in the right place. Their response to, well, what about, max freedom of movement for some Palestinians? All of these kinds of questions. I think to some, boil the question down, they would respond to you by saying, well, what about the Palestinian? How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say it's a very important issue, but it's a little bit separate. And the reason why I say that is because apartheid, it's too picky, but it's a label that is applied to a situation in which a government is actively discriminating against its own citizens because of a particular identity that they hold or claim. In this case, Palestinians are not claiming Israeli citizenship or belonging to the Jewish state. They are actively working against that in the sense that they have their own movement for national self-independence and that sort of thing, which they have a right to do. But if they're going to claim this right to seek their own independence and freedom from Israel, that sort of thing, then by definition, they are not citizens of the state of Israel. They do not have access to the same set of rights that a citizen of Israel would. Now, I do want to make a couple of important points here as well. It's a bit hypocritical to argue that we should be recognizing a state of Palestine and its sovereignty, and argue at the very same time that Palestinians should have freedom of movement between Palestinian territories and Israel, for example, that Israel should not have a border fence or in certain places a wall between itself and Palestinian territories. You really wouldn't apply that standard to hardly any other country. If Palestine really considers itself to be free and independent and a separate state than Israel, then it's really not fair to argue that having border security is a form of discrimination or apartheid. It's not. It's having border security, so every other country will do. The other thing that follows from that, however, is that I do want to caution that if Israel were to suddenly annex everything that Palestinians claim and declare that it has permanent jurisdiction over all Palestinians, and it were to continue to restrict the freedom of movement or to deny their rights that belong to every other Israeli citizens, then that would effectively be a form of apartheid. And it's something that we have to think about very carefully when advocating for things like annexation, for example. That necessarily means that Palestinians would need to have more rights, or there would be a problem. And everything is a problem right now, but that's only because the territories are disputed and it's still being worked out whether Palestinians have their own state or will eventually be folded into the state of Israel.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's all the questions that I have for you. This episode of Hot Seat. Don't worry, there will be plenty more. I am a woman of many questions. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Josiah, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to leave with our audience?
Sure. I'll just say, echo what Olivia said. Thank you so much for joining us. Do hope that this episode is helpful and some of these questions have just been burning in your minds. Also, I'd like to thank you to Lindsay, our producer, who thought with us today, but have to do the fun job of editing all of this after the fact. It's a little bit more complicated because of where we are and the noise and all that. So thank you, Lindsay, for making this sound good so everyone can enjoy it after the fact.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you liked this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.